Welcome to Metropolitan Community College's second Diversity Matters book series discussion for the 24-25 academic year. I'm so glad you all joined us today. So we're actually in our 17th year of this book series, which I think is pretty cool. And we just want to thank you all for attending, especially Dr. Albee, who will be our presenter and who I'll talk a little bit about in a second, and then just all of you as well for joining. This series really encourages us to continue the important work of encouraging people to read and promoting diverse topics and authors. So if you would like to revisit any previous year's book discussions, MCC has a YouTube page where you can find recordings of those. So there's some really great discussions on there if you're interested in those. And we'll put that YouTube link in the chat as well. So I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Laura Albee. Dr. Albee has been an emergency physician at Methodist Hospital and Methodist Women's Hospital since 2012. Prior to that, she practiced in Iowa and Michigan. She has been the medical director for you'll have to correct me if I am wrong, Dr. Albee, but the Heidi Wilkie SANE SART program at Methodist since 2019. And it says
Correct.
this, is that correct? Am I right on
Yes.
that? Okay.
Mhm.
And this program provides specialized forensic nursing care to patients who have been subject to sexual assault, domestic violence, strangulation, and elder abuse. Dr. Albee has been the medical director for Heal Omaha since it was founded in 2022. Heal Omaha is a nonprofit organization that provides medical care to people experiencing homelessness, primarily through volunteers. So we really want to thank Heal Omaha for working with us on this event. And Dr. Albee, we're really excited to hear a little bit more about Heal Omaha and ways that you're working in the Omaha community as well. So thank you, Heal Omaha. Dr. Albee grew up watching her grandfather provide medical care to people in rural Western Nebraska and learned from her parents, who were both nurses. She loves adventure and participated in wilderness survival and medicine courses in Central America during medical school and residency. She assisted with clinics in rural villages in Belize and Guatemala and managed logistics to set up a field hospital in Belize, which is really cool. She was also a rescue diver and team physician for the dive rescue team in Saginaw, Michigan during her residency. Dr. Albee served as the president of Nebraska ACEP, which is the American College of Emergency Physicians, from 2017 to 2019. She was on the Nebraska board for that organization for 5 years and met with legislators in Washington, D.C. to discuss healthcare issues and advocate for patients. She is a lead author for a soon-to-be-published 3-volume book series entitled Domestic to Interpersonal Violence: An Interdisciplinary Approach. And outside of work, she tries to keep up with her 3 amazing kids and their beloved pets, including 2 dogs, 2 cats, and a turtle. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Laura Albee. So I would clap, but we're on Zoom. So
Thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah said, we're talking about the book Rough Sleepers, Dr. Jim O'Connell's urgent mission to bring healing to homeless people. Just to tell you a little bit about Heal, it's a nonprofit street medicine program in Omaha that was founded in 2022 by Wendy Pecoraro. She's a nurse practitioner. And we had a grant from the International Street Medicine Institute. HEAL stands for Health Equity in Action League. This is kind of a summary of the book Rough Sleepers. It's the story of Dr. Jim O'Connell, who spent his career providing medical care to people who are experiencing homelessness in Boston, starting in the 1980s. It's also the story and perspective of the people who live on the streets of Boston, who he refers to as the rough sleepers. And included in this presentation are some words of wisdom from Dr. Jim Withers. He practices street medicine in Pittsburgh and founded the International Street Medicine Institute. That's who gave us our grant to start Heal Omaha. So in 1985, Dr. Jim O'Connell was finishing his internal medicine residency at Massachusetts General Hospital and was planning to start his fellowship training in oncology. He had taken a meandering path after college. He studied philosophy at Notre Dame, and then he continued his philosophy studies at the University of Cambridge in England. He spent a couple of years in Hawaii teaching and coaching, and then returned home to Newport, where he tended bar. He was on vacation when he had a chance encounter with a motorcycle accident, and this is what sparked his interest in medicine. He found himself comforting the accident victim, listening to him talk about his life, which he described as a bartender's art, listening to the man describe the paths his life had taken. He then attended Harvard Medical School, which he started at age 30, and then a residency in internal medicine. He was about to accept an oncology fellowship when he was conscripted by the chief of medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital to lead the New Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, which is referred to throughout this book as the program. Most people who work in street medicine and street outreach would say that this work finds you. I can relate to this, as I was conscripted by Wendy when she founded Heal Omaha and asked me to serve as medical director. Wendy and I had worked together for years in the emergency department and then kept in touch. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but I was intrigued, and similar to Jim in the book, I'm not good at saying no. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to attend the International Street Medicine Symposium in Kansas City, Missouri. So I included some quotes from Dr. Jim Withers and some stories from their program. Kansas City has a very robust street medicine program called Care Beyond the Boulevard, which was also started by a nurse. And I emphasize the word perspective in this slide because it's so important in life, and this book gives us numerous perspectives of both the caregivers and the patients, so we can try and understand the perspective of others. Jim's first experience at the Pine Street Inn Shelter Medical Clinic that was started and run by nurses. He had some barriers to overcome given the nurse's previous experience and perception of physicians. We're introduced to a couple of nurses in this chapter, Barbara Blakeney and Barbara McGinnis, and the wisdom and heart of Barbara McGinnis is woven throughout the book. I know another remarkable nurse named Barbara, and she's on this call, my mother. I grew up listening to her words of wisdom. So the nurses told Jim, we don't need medicine coming in here and changing what we do. You have to let us retrain you. If you come in with your doctor questions, you won't learn anything. You have to learn to listen to these patients. And in the clinic, the foot soaking place the provider at the foot of the patient they're serving. And we talk about the servant's position in street medicine. So when we're taking care of people on the street, we're usually kneeling or crouching or sitting next to them on a bench or a stool, because it takes away the power dynamic. You don't want to be standing or towering over them. And this helps with trust building, which is the most important foundation of street medicine. Many of our patients have lost trust in people, in society, in the medical system, legal system, government. And as street outreach workers, we're responsible for helping to restore their trust in humanity. We must be consistent, reliable, don't promise things we can't follow through on, be patient, not pushy, withhold judgment, be honest about what to expect going forward or what we can offer. And while Jim spent time soaking people's feet, he discovered that patients with a history of frostbite or trench foot had a much higher death rate, and learned that you can tell a lot about a person's health from their feet. They encountered an outbreak of antibiotic resistant tuberculosis, and Jim had to get creative to try to keep contact with and ensure treatment in this population of rough sleepers, thinking outside the box or ingenuity. One of the requirements of the grant program that they used to establish the program was to establish a respite care facility. The program rented 25 beds at a homeless shelter at Shattuck Hospital, and it opened in the early days of the TB outbreak. And then a week later, a patient with AIDS arrived. So they had 60 men with active TB were identified that would need to take 4 antibiotics daily for a year and a half to treat this drug-resistant strain of TB. Many of the men left the shelter after they found out that they contracted TB there. This made it much more difficult to keep them engaged with treatment. There were state and city agencies that helped. Jim found 8 of the men were regulars at a nearby bar. So the bartender would make them take their antibiotics before he would pour them a beer. He also found a barber shop where 3 of the men frequented, so they were given their medications by the barber. The medical respite facility quickly became an AIDS treatment center. Staff were scrambling to treat opportunistic infections like pneumocystis pneumonia, Kaposi sarcoma, cryptococcal meningitis, and toxoplasmosis. Kaposi sarcoma is a type of skin cancer. Meningitis and toxoplasmosis are brain infections, and these are infections that infect people with weak immune systems. And anyone who got these illnesses died. Some people lost housing due to fear about how the virus was transmitted. If they were living with family or partners, they were sometimes kicked out of the house because people are afraid of catching the disease. And just a kind of a brief timeline of AIDS in the 1980s. In 1981, there were case reports of people who were developing these rare opportunistic infections, and the virus had been spreading unknown for at least 10 years in the US. In 1984, they identified the HIV virus that causes AIDS. And then in 1985 was the first approved blood test to test for HIV. And a few years later, we finally had medications to start treating HIV to reduce the progression to AIDS and reduce transmission. Jim started taking a van to the streets and discovered that many people do not come to shelter or clinic. The assumption before that was that if people needed to, they would come to the clinic. But what he found is that a lot of people avoid the shelters because they can't sleep in a room with that many people. There's a lot of drugs and alcohol in the shelter, around the shelters. And if they're trying to stay sober, that can be very challenging. If they have a tent or a home set up, they don't want to lose their possessions. So even if they were to leave for a few hours to go to clinic, they may come back to nothing. One man in the book described too much noise, too many voices. Look, Doc, if I'm at Pine Street, I can't tell which voices are mine and which are somebody else's. When I stay out here, I know the voices are mine and I can control them a little. To Tony, who we meet in the book, homeless shelters felt like a prison. The chapter about the Pantheon explores the reasons for the increasing rates of homelessness, including shabby treatment of Vietnam veterans. Psychiatric hospitals were closing, which happened in the town where I grew up. Decline in jobs and wages for unskilled workers, racist housing policies, low-income neighborhoods were torn down and renovated into nicer apartments or homes that were then unaffordable. The AIDS epidemic, the drug epidemic, the complex processes of applying for disability, financial cuts and programs for the poor, and government policies that led to declines and the supply of inexpensive housing. A new face. This is where we meet Tony, who first came to clinic in 2016, and his story is woven throughout the book. He's in his late 40s when he arrives at clinic. And Jim talks about the concept of pre-admiration. Tony was a large, loud, sometimes hard to handle gentleman. And with pre-admiration, Jim would think, I'm eventually going to like this person. I will probably find some reason over time to like them. I just happen to not know it yet. Tony had spent 18 years in jail and had been homeless ever since. He had a very traumatic childhood. Once he ended up in prison, he found some routine and purpose. He did become dependent on Suboxone in jail and after jail, as well as other drugs to treat his physical pain and anxiety. So when he first came to clinic to meet Jim, he helped build trust with Tony by listening and then giving him weekly prescription for Suboxone and helping him stay on that medication. Every person we meet has a lesson to teach us, whether it be good or how we don't want to act. And therapeutic listening is another principle of street medicine. Tony ended up becoming an asset to the clinic, providing counseling to other patients. He was kind of eyes on the ground, a protector on the streets. And he found purpose again with the clinic and trying to help Jim. Therapeutic listening is very important in street medicine. Sometimes we can't offer a lot, but just listening to someone's story and let them get their feelings out can be very therapeutic. In the book, you try to take care of people, meet them where they are, figure out who they are, and figure out what they need, how you can ease their suffering. Dr. Jim's chance encounter with a motorcycle crash, as he told that story, he listened to the man and comforted him until EMS arrived, but at that time did not know how to take care of the broken leg. Jim Withers from Pittsburgh said, go to the people, love them, serve them, honor them. Acknowledge their suffering, their trauma, and offer hope for tomorrow. You can ask someone, would you be willing to share your story with me? Patient-centered care is another principle of street medicine, asking the patient, what do you need in this moment? What are you willing or able to do? Try to figure out their priorities and what motivates them. Help them develop a plan which builds resilience, a plan for today and a plan for tomorrow. Planning beyond tomorrow can be very overwhelming. So just taking it one day at a time or 1 hour at a time, you don't want to get too far ahead. And give them affirmations for hope and help them build confidence. You're going to get through this. Santo's story on page 45. Jim met Santo at the Pine Street Inn clinic, and Santo could not swallow food. And now he could not swallow liquids, including vodka, which he was dependent on. He was found to have esophageal cancer. So Jim arranged for him to get a feeding tube inserted into his stomach and got him admitted to a nursing home. And he was quite proud of himself for providing this care for Santo, but he lasted less than a week in the nursing home. He missed his community and his vodka. People in the nursing home were staring out the window or staring at the TV. Nobody was talking. So he went back to be around his people. He knew he was dying and wanted to be with his community. The street team meeting, we learn about how the multidisciplinary team meets to discuss the medical issues and psychosocial issues, as well as the complex logistical issues of street medicine. We always talk about trimorbidity when somebody has chronic illness that we're trying to treat, mental illness and substance abuse. I liked the quote by Mike. I think passive suicide is normal. It was for me. It's not that you don't want to live, but you don't know how to live. And we see this a lot in the ER. So I just really like this quote. There's a lot of people who think, I can't go on, I don't want to wake up, but they don't have a plan. But it's more that I don't know how to go on living. There's very complex logistics of trying to help patients make appointments, especially if they don't have a phone, get to those appointments, get their medications, get to therapy, fill out applications for disability or housing, and connection to service organizations. Omaha has the Threshold Continuum of Care, which is a group of social workers run through the city. So they actually help with housing referrals and Medicaid and all of those other services. So HEAL, we just focus on the medical aspect. Dr. Bonner was a psychiatrist that worked with the program. And for years after he met with patients, he estimated that 90% had been afflicted by substance abuse and or mental illness, and at least 75% had suffered physical and psychological effects of childhood trauma. Trauma-informed care is another principle of street medicine. We've all had trauma. We're all flawed, forgivable humans. Another quote from Jim Withers. We want to acknowledge someone's trauma, listen to their story, withhold judgment, and provide affirmations. We talk about big trauma versus little trauma. Big trauma are it's a life-threatening event that causes immediate and severe distress. This can be abuse, war, natural disaster, terrorist attack, kidnapping, severe medical event, or a serious accident, sexual assault, and sudden loss of a loved one. And then little traumas are things like chronic neglect, perfectionism, people pleasing, unhealthy relationships, bullying, parental pressure, feeling overwhelmed with responsibilities, legal or financial trouble, infidelity, more day-to-day type things. A person's response to trauma is not a choice with how our brain initially processes trauma. So that's how we can form triggers. And then when we're providing trauma-informed care, we have to remember that a person's behavior is a reflection of themselves and their experience. It's not about you. So if you try to help somebody and they yell at you or they don't want help, that's okay. It's not about you. We just want to convey that I respect you and I care about you, and they have the right to say no. These are the adverse childhood experiences that are recognized and have been studied many times. Abuse, neglect, domestic violence, substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, criminal behavior, and parental separation or divorce. And if somebody has 4 or more of these experiences in childhood, it predicts adverse outcomes in adulthood. This is a simplified picture of the brain to show the areas where trauma response occurs. So trauma can send someone into fight or flight mode. If the brain processes trauma through the amygdala, we're prone to triggers and being thrown into fight or flight response without much control. And this causes anxiety and panic. If we take time to process trauma through the prefrontal cortex, we can respond better to triggers. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for rational thought, decision-making, and problem solving. This area shrinks in response to trauma. The hippocampus shrinks, which causes difficulty differentiating between past and present. So if we are triggered, our brain has trouble remembering that that event happened years ago. The amygdala becomes overactive, which increases the stress response or the fight or flight response. So for a person living on the street in survival mode all the time, they may be easily triggered. They're so focused on survival, like making shelter, protecting themselves, finding food and water. It's difficult to navigate complex processes that require reasoning and problem solving, like getting a copy of their birth certificate or their ID or doing a housing application. In Angels Without Wings, Tony showers Jim and the street team with praise. You're creating an army to catch them once they fall. Jim was uncomfortable with praise. He said, this work is way too interesting to be looked at as saintly. And I would agree with that. This work is actually refreshing. We get to spend time talking with people, hearing their stories. Sometimes they need medical care, sometimes they just need someone to listen. They're always appreciative. It's very different from the ER setting where I normally work, where we have time constraints, many patients at one time, requirements from the hospital, the insurance companies, expectations from patients and families. There's just always a lot going on. And in street medicine, we can focus on one person at a time. Tony had spent his childhood trying to survive in his own home, and it never occurred to him to care about his own health or well-being. Once Tony made contact with the program and Jim, I feel like I'll let you down if I don't come in clean. Here you are helping me. I got to do the other half and stuff. So it gave Tony some incentive to try to do better. The memorial service, they talk about how the street team held an annual memorial service at Mousy Park near the hospital to remember and honor the rough sleepers who died over the previous year. Omaha has memorial services like this every year, and they do it on the longest night of the year in December. And most of the shelters hold a service, so there's multiple services each year in Omaha. Upside down medicine. Corporate management and medical practices results in a profound loss of autonomy for many physicians. With the program's initial grant funding, they had some restrictions and requirements to adhere to, which most grants do, but they were kind of able to build and mold the program, and they had the grant money no matter how many patients they saw. Once the grants ran out and they started billing Medicaid, there's much more restrictions and requirements to adhere to. Barbara on page 90 said, you just have to be there and be present. If need be, stand with them in the darkness. In the early 1990s, the program bought an old nursing home and made it into a medical respite facility, the Barbara McGinnis House. Medicine is not efficient. It's not supposed to be efficient. It has nothing to do with efficiency. Jim was referring to the art of medicine, which it's difficult to maintain that when we have restrictions and benchmarks in place by hospitals and insurance companies. Death by housing. They did start a Housing First program in 2005 in Boston, and they received 24 housing vouchers for rough sleepers. Every team member believed that dignified housing was a universal human right. They've discovered that once someone is housed, they need ongoing resources to adapt and find their purpose, because there's a shift in priorities. It's almost like culture shock. They talked about one man who pitched a tent in his own apartment. Some people may not know how to clean a stove or a bathroom, pay bills, shop for groceries. One man couldn't sleep in a quiet apartment. He went outside and made a tape recording of traffic and sirens so that he could sleep, because that's what he was used to. One man called saying, I watched everything on TV. Now what am I supposed to do? Some people, when they get housed, they miss their community of friends, which is their support system. And they go from a life of survival, trying to find safe shelter, food, maybe a shower, and they're placed into an apartment in our consumer society where they're expected to get a job, pay bills, pay rent, buy things, and they just have no skill set for that. So it's important to have a transition team to help them learn new skills and shifting priorities. I did get a taste of this during medical school when I attended the wilderness survival and rescue courses in Belize. We lived in the jungle in an open air hut. Sometimes we spent nights in the jungle where we had to build our own shelter, hunt our own food. And it took a couple of days to adjust because there was no electricity, no clocks. You eat, they would feed us, so we'd eat when they fed us. We woke up when the sun came up. But it was actually quite easy to adjust to. It just took a couple days. And then it was very fulfilling and joyful way to live. When I came back to the US, it was actually a harder adjustment because the priorities are so much different. I was driving in my car, and on the radio, a news story came on about Jessica Simpson was spotted wearing mom jeans. And all I could think was, do people actually care about this? Is this really news? Like, it was just so different. And just a good perspective to have, I think. Spot was an area in the respite or clinic that they developed, the supportive place for observation and treatment. This was a room where people could sleep off whatever drugs they'd ingested, usually a cocktail of prescription drugs or sometimes laced with heroin or fentanyl. And Jim had the epiphany. Spot. It's the kindest, gentlest thing going for the roughest living people. It's all these people sleeping in there being cared for by these wonderful nurses. It's the foot soak clinic. And this brings us to the concept of harm reduction. Harm reduction is an important part of street medicine. You try and help a person reduce harm in their current situation. This helps build trust and may help build their confidence to leave the situation in the future. When you're ready, we're here for you. It may not be safe for someone to leave their current situation in cases of domestic violence or human trafficking. So we help them build trust and formulate a plan for when they're ready to leave, and then teach people about their rights and resources. These are just some examples of harm reduction. General types of harm reduction can be just teaching first aid. If somebody is living outside and they get cut, how to take care of it so it doesn't get infected. Providing them with dry socks, hats, gloves, condoms, vaccines, things to protect them from infections and frostbite. With drug use, it involves clean needles and naloxone in case of overdose. Domestic violence and human trafficking involves safety planning for when they can safely get out of the situation. And then also HIV and STI prophylaxis and treatment. Searching for meaning, and this is where we get a better idea of Tony's history so we can understand him better. He was born in the backseat of his father's car. You were a troublemaker from the start. He was subject to lots of different types of childhood traumas, physical abuse, family history of mental illness. He witnessed a murder at a very young age 6. His grandmother was killed by his uncle who was trying to get drug money. He and his brother plotted ways to try to kill or poison his father, who would beat everyone in the family. Tried to shoot himself at one point. He missed school frequently and then dropped out at 16. He was sexually abused at some point and became involved in criminal activity. So from our list of adverse childhood experiences, he had at least 7 or 8 of them. So at 26, he was sentenced to prison for 18 years, assault with intent to commit rape. But in prison, he found a semblance of routine and a sense of purpose. He helped maintain order and sometimes prevented fights. He counseled other prisoners as they entered prison. And so when he left, he was kind of lost. I was a big man in prison. When I got out, I was a nobody. Technology had advanced without him. He was walking around looking for a payphone which didn't exist anymore. He couldn't figure out how to turn on a bathroom faucet because it was sensor instead of knobs. He had no support system. He bought drugs to self-medicate his pain and anxiety, and eventually made his way to Dr. Jim when he was looking for the Suboxone prescription. The program tried to help him get housed, but because he was a sex offender, he did not qualify for most of the vouchers or apartments. But he found his purpose again with Jim in the clinic, helping at the center, counseling patients, a liaison to people on the streets, a protector on the streets. He helped keep track of patients and staff and kept Jim updated. We meet Larry. Larry first met Barbara at the subway station in Chinatown. He said, I was getting ready to jump onto the tracks, and this woman I never seen before comes up and puts her arm around my shoulder. Young man, are you getting ready to do something? I said, no. She said, come walk and talk with me. And we walked over to Pine Street. Larry ended up becoming a member of the board of the program. And that's a very important perspective to have on any board involving homelessness or street medicine, as people with lived experience. Barbara's act of caring and kindness saved his life and put him on a new trajectory. And we learned a little more about Larry. He grew up in a rough neighborhood without a father, and at age 6, he was walking to school alone. He started walking past school to the Franklin Park Zoo. He repeated multiple grades because he missed so much school. So by age 6, he was a teenager and dropped out of school. He had started drinking alcohol by age 10 or 12, started using dope at 18, first snorting heroin, and then spent decades injecting heroin. He never had a job. He mostly stemmed or panhandled near Fenway Park. The program ended up getting him housed, and he woke up one morning in his room with a needle in his eye. So again, talks about the need for transition programs. Eventually, he detoxed with the help of the program and stayed sober on methadone. And then they got him housed and he became part of the board. We learn about John Controni, and that may have been John's story. I'm sorry. I confused John and Larry. But he would meet Jim on Friday mornings at a coffee shop near Mousy Park called Finagle a Bagel, and he would give a weekly update. He was Jim's eyes on the ground. Once people like John get housed, they realize they have nothing in their lives. How do we fill their lives with something meaningful? And these are various stories from our patients in Omaha, and then also a woman in Kansas City who spoke to us at the street medicine symposium. And I've changed the names to protect their privacy, but we have a patient, Peter, that he lives in his van. He has a long history of methamphetamine abuse. So he has cardiomyopathy and heart failure from that. And he's frequently in the ER, frequently gets hospitalized. He always leaves against medical advice. He has no support system. Melissa, who is currently our chief operating officer and nurse, built trust with Peter over time. She would visit him in his van, visit him in the hospital. And he has end stage heart failure. He cannot recover. She was able to get him into a nursing home, and he's on hospice, but he's found a purpose at the nursing home. He helps other patients, he helps the nurses, and he's been reconnected to some of his family members. There's one patient in particular we've been working with the infectious disease clinic at Nebraska Medicine to get him his HIV meds and the labs that he needs to stay on those meds. And so we now have a collaboration with the HIV clinic at Nebraska Medicine so that we can help take care of their unhoused patients. I think we're getting short on time, so I'll skip some of these, but Candace from Kansas City She was a victim of human trafficking or slavery for over 20 years. A street outreach nurse from Care Beyond the Boulevard in Kansas City introduced herself and gave Candace a self-care pack. The nurse came by every week to visit Candace. The first few weeks, she accepted the self-care pack but didn't talk or say anything. Eventually, the nurse was able to build trust with Candace by being consistent and reliable. The nurse was able to connect her to resources to help her escape her trafficking situation. Now she works for Skull Games and is a public speaker. Skull Games is an organization that provides analytical and operational support to law enforcement to intercept sex predators. Candace also provides street outreach from her lived experience. And her main piece of advice is do for one what you want to do for many. And I think that's so important that we all feel like we want to help or do something, but you feel like it won't matter or um, it won't make a difference. And she's a very good case of helping one person. She has gone on to help countless other people get out of their situation. This is just a recap of the principles of street medicine that are outlined well throughout this book. But number one is trust building, therapeutic listening, withhold judgment, trauma-informed care, patient-centered care, harm reduction, where we teach people to take better care of themselves and help make their situation better, and advocacy. We teach people their rights as a human being, and we can also advocate for those who do not have a voice with government. Thank you for letting me speak with you today. We can take some questions.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Albee, thank you. That was very interesting, and I really appreciate your insight as you do this work, on a regular basis. So, if you have questions, you can send them in the chat, and I can ask Dr. Albee. And while you're doing that, if you have any, I have a few questions myself. So, I was thinking about some of the social stigmas that are associated with homelessness. And I was wondering if you see some of those in your work with HEAL, and how do those stigmas impact the lives of rough sleepers?
Well, I think a lot of people assume that rough sleepers are dangerous. I've never felt threatened when we're out making street rounds. Sometimes we're meeting with one or two people at a time. Sometimes we're in an encampment. Omaha has fairly small encampments, maybe 8 to 10 people.
Mhm.
Um, and we just announce that we're coming, hello, street outreach. And if people want to talk to us, they come out of their tent or shelter. If they don't want to talk to us, they stay in. Um, or they'll say, leave me alone. But I've never felt threatened or endangered by anybody. Um, I think there's a stigma that they're purposefully taking advantage of people or trying to take advantage of the system. And mostly they're trying to survive. And like, literally day-to-day survival. So they can't really think through those complex processes of how to get more help or how to better their situation. And then people in general are just quick to pass judgment and make assumptions about people. So if you encounter a homeless person, it's okay to say hi, see if they want to talk. Are you willing to share your story with me? They can be very interesting to talk to if you have the time and ask, is there anything you need? Is there, some people like to carry supplies in their car, like dry socks or gloves or snack packs. Those are things that you can offer if you don't want to give cash like Jim did.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think thinking about some of those stigmas that, and then how there's probably a little bit of a lack of trust between initially between maybe some of the street medicine teams that come out and the people that you're working with. How do you build that trust, or how do you see that built? How does that work? Just is it just
Um, it's just
pers-
mostly
hmm
consistency. So
hmm
initially when Heal started, we only had 3 or 4 of us doing this work. And so we would tag along with the street outreach team that works on housing
hmm
because they're well known in the community. And so we could learn the lay of the land and, um, meet people and find out where they're staying. And then now that we're doing our own medical street rounds, we try and keep it consistent. So the same days of the week at the same time. And people learn that, well, we know they're going to stop by on Tuesday evening or something.
hmm
And if you tell them that next time I see you, I'll bring this, then bring it. Or, we don't make grand promises. You can only promise what you can actually deliver. So it's
hmm
just as Jim Withers and from the Street Medicine Institute, he loves to say that homeless people are the best bullshit detectors. So don't promise things that you can't deliver on
hmm
and just be consistent. And over time, that's how you'll gain their trust and then maybe start to help them build a better life.
hmm Absolutely. So we had a question from the audience, who said, this question says, on page 76, it talks about rough sleepers needing to pick up meds every week because there's nowhere to store them. Have you seen this
Mhm.
in Omaha, and how do you manage that?
Yes, it's difficult because either, if they say their encampment gets moved, sometimes they get robbed. So it's just very frequent that their meds get lost or stolen along with their IDs and everything else. That's why they're um you can't apply for a job without an ID.
Mhm,
You also need an address to get a job or an ID. There's all these barriers, but um when we see patients who, if it's short-term medications like an antibiotic or something, most of the people that we work with are on Medicaid. And so usually we just call that prescription to the nearest pharmacy. A lot of times they're within a block or two of a pharmacy that they use. They have Medicaid, so we can just call it to that pharmacy. There's a pharmacy in town that we work with called Pharmacy Express. And they're wonderful about knowing how to get medications as cheap as possible through all these various drug programs. And so if someone doesn't have insurance, we can get their meds there. We'll pick up the medication and deliver it to them. Um, and then, like I said, working with the HIV clinic, we've had talks with the health department to help deliver vaccines, or if there's people that test positive for sexually transmitted infections, that we can try and get antibiotics to them. So we do our best. Like if it's a weekly medication that they need, that we would try to meet with them once a week, but we don't have a clinic structure right now to do that.
mhm. I was wondering, so you spoke a little bit about kind of community contacts that Dr. Jim used. So for example, the bar where
Yes,
the coffee shop. And I was
yes.
wondering if Omaha has that kind, if you see kind of that community aspect. Because you're talking about the pharmacy that you use that works with you
Hmm.
to get medicines and things like that. Do you have that kind of community here? Is that being built?
I think that I loved those examples, and I think that was partly um, possible because it was the 1980s. We have a lot of restrictions in place now for patient privacy, and we have paperwork that patients sign to work with Heal so that we can have access to their medical information, and we can um, share it with Medicaid if they have Medicaid. but I think it would be very difficult in this day and age to
Mhm.
work out that kind of agreement just
Mhm.
because of patient privacy laws. But I thought
Yeah.
that was very ingenious.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that flexibility that he had to do that.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the last question and then to leave you with is just so I see some links in the chat and I was wondering if you
Hmm.
could tell us, you know, what can we do? How can we, you talked about when we encounter homeless people, we can talk to them, we can, you know, be human and treat them like
Yes.
humans. But what else can we do? And any sort of insight you have.
Well, just regarding the links, the first one is it's just a YouTube video that's about 10 minutes long about how Finland found a solution to homelessness using a housing first program, but then so they just put people in housing immediately. You don't here you have to prove disability income. You have to apply for lots of things, get on waiting lists. I mean, it can take 8 to 12 months to to finally get into an apartment, sometimes longer. And so in that model, they just put people into housing immediately and then bring all of the social workers and services to them in their apartment, and you can find them because you know where they are. And so it tends to take a couple of months to get everything in place, and then they get a job and they start helping to pay their rent. Um, and so it's really interesting to see, and maybe we could push our government or kind of advocate for those types of programs. The International Street Medicine Institute, that's a link to their website. They have a lot of good resources. I have a link to Heal Omaha's website. And then the Flatwater Free Press has done a couple of articles about Heal. They've gone out with us on street outreach a few times. So this is a link to the most recent article, but I think if you go to the Flatwater Free Press and search Heal, there's other articles that come up. And then, it kind of depends on what your capacity is. If you happen to know how to advocate for people or you like to write letters, send letters to senator, the mayor, just to try and advocate for better services for homeless people. If you drive around a lot, you can keep supply packs in your car. Um, like I said, with snacks, dry socks, gloves, hats, that type of thing. For big groups, if you have a big group that wants to help in some way, coat drives and sock drives and glove drives and that type of thing um, can be helpful to either to Heal and to other street outreach organizations. They always need sleeping bags and blankets, and um, with the threshold COC, the Omaha um, outreach group, they have access to a large food pantry. So every time they go out, they take bottles of water, and then snack packs or food packs, that type of thing.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, those are great ideas. I think I will, with my kids, work on making some snack packs. So I think that's a
Yes.
great idea.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Albee, it really has been a great pleasure to have you with us today, share your experiences and your insights, and we appreciate it. You can go to the evaluation. There's a QR code, and then there's also a link. I would love to thank the Metropolitan Community College Library staff because they assist annually with this book series. Thank you all for your time and attention today. This is such a probably always timely, always relevant topic. And it's really good to hear about the things that are going on and what we can do. More information is always available on our website. It's mccneb.edu/intercultural. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your attention. And again, thank you to Dr. Albee. So virtual round of applause. So thank you very much. And please go check out Heal Omaha and their work. I actually found them through a Flatwater Free Press article and then started following them. And then I really enjoy seeing what you're doing on social media. So I encourage you to follow their organization as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.